Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the UCSF Family and Community Medicine Grand Rounds today. We are very excited to welcome a wonderful speaker, Dr. Michelle DeThomas. But before we get started, I have the usual housekeeping announcements. I just want to remind everybody that this session is being recorded. And that we would really love to have this be an engaging and interactive session for you. So if you have questions or comments, please use the Q&A section to share your questions or thoughts with us, and we'll make sure that we get to talk about them with Michelle and we can answer them live. Also, if you missed part of today's session, or you want to see a prior grand rounds, or you just want to look back at all of them in aggregate, please visit us. All of the sessions are uploaded onto the UCSF Department of Family and Community Medicine website, where you can see this or any other grand round session. We do take the topic seriously. We take your comments seriously. We'd love to hear your feedback for us and for the presenters. So if you could take time today to fill out the session evaluation, which Roy will post in the chat partway through the session, that'd be great. We would appreciate your comments, and so would the presenters. I want to, before we go any further, also thank our wonderful tech team today. We have Roy Johnston, John Tess, and Erigo Mitchell supporting us to make this session possible. So I want to give them a special shout out. And most of all, I want to welcome Dr. Michelle DeThomas, who's presenting today's topic, which is hospice and palliative care and compassionate release. How do we as a society and as clinician advocates better meet the needs of an aging prison population? Decades of harsh sentencing law have resulted in over 200,000 people in the United States currently serving life sentences, with a disproportionate impact on people of color. In California, despite an overall decline in the numbers behind bars in the past decade, the number of people aged 55 and older has nearly doubled. Studies have shown that the chronic disease burden and the degree of functional impairment of incarcerated people is similar to those 10 or 15 years older in the community, or as more and more older adults are facing the prospect of aging, coping with serious illness, and dying in prison. So how do we as a society and as clinicians better advocate to meet the needs of this aging population pre-sentencing, during incarceration, and also upon reentry? Our speaker today, who I'm so excited to welcome, is Dr. Michelle DeThomas. Michelle has a long and I hope wonderful history. It's wonderful history with UCSF. Michelle earned her medical degree from UCSF through the joint UC Berkeley medical program and the JMP. She completed her residency in the Department of Family and Community Medicine, and very importantly, she was one of the first residents that I got to work with when she was an intern in Linkage, and I was a first-year faculty member. So I'm so glad to see her back. Like many of our alums, like all of our alums, Michelle has gone on to do wonderful things with her career. She's currently the Chief Medical Executive at the Palliative Care Initiative with the California Correctional Healthcare Services, which strives to improve whole person care for those struggling with the challenges of serious illness and aging behind bars. Since 2007, Michelle has also served as Chief Physician and Hospice Medical Director at the California Medical Facility, which provides end-of-life care to men incarcerated in the California Department of Corrections. As a hospice medical director, Michelle works with a hospice team to create an environment where patients can live their final days with dignity, respect, and comfort despite their incarceration. The hospice team supports the patients and their families in achieving compassionate release, and when this is not possible, provides a setting where they are able to have meaningful visits and often find reconciliation and closure at the end of life. I am delighted to welcome Dr. Michelle DeThomas. Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you, Margot. I appreciate being here. So I wanted to start just a little bit about my pathway to, sorry, I'm just trying to get the camera. Okay, so I wanted to start a little bit with my pathway to correctional medicine. So you mentioned that I did most of my clinical training at San Francisco General, and I was on the red team in Family Health Center. And so many of our patients struggle with mental health issues, substance use disorder, and intermittent incarceration. So I definitely had an interest in their stories, in how trauma has impacted their incarceration. And in 2004, right after I was finishing my chief residency year, there was a lawsuit against the state of California for constitutionally inadequate medical care within the prison system. So a group of men got together and sued the state, and the judge agreed with them and ended up putting the medical portion of the California Department of Corrections under a federal receivership. And at that point, they gave a large grant to UCSF. It went to the Department of Family and Community Medicine, and the Correctional Medicine Consultation Network was created. I was asked to be part of that because of my interests, and I was assigned to the California Medical Facility back in 2006. Since that time, part of what my job was to train primary care providers, to develop population management tools, to help do chart review and improve the overall care. And since that time, the care within CDCR has dramatically improved. All of our patients have access to primary care teams. The physicians are all board certified in family medicine or internal medicine now. Things like population management, our diabetes management tools allow us to have an A1C that's better than the Kaiser averages. All of our patients get access to Hep C treatment. We have tens of thousands of people who are now getting medication-assisted therapy, and we've reduced our overdose rates by 50%, despite a rise in the community in the same time frame. But one area that just continues to pose a challenge is caring for older adults in this setting. As I was preparing for this talk, I was trying to clarify for myself, like, what are my goals? And I think it's really as simple as just wanting to increase awareness of the challenges facing those who are aging behind bars. Your patients all too often are these patients at different times in their lives. Many of your patients have lost loved ones to mass incarceration. There are 2.2 million children with an incarcerated parent in this country, and 11 million people cycle in and out of jails and prisons each year. Some of you on this call are watching this, have personal connections to those living and dying in prison, but the stigma of incarceration means that many do not share the impact with their healthcare providers, with their friends, with their coworkers, and so it remains a problem of others. So brief overview. First, we're going to look at some background data, then we'll discuss the needs of the aging population, pre-sentencing, during incarceration, and post-incarceration. And finally, we'll consider some potential roles of healthcare workers in addressing some of these challenges. So the United States incarcerates more people than any other country in the world. In the United States, the data I have showing is 2021. I think currently we're at about 629 people per 100,000. When you look at California, we're slightly lower than the average United States population, but we're higher than this chart compares to founding NATO countries. So other countries with similar democracies. If we look at Canada, we incarcerate 6 times more people than Canada. And if we look at a somewhat more progressive criminal justice system like Norway, we incarcerate over 10 times more people per 100,000 than that country. There was a Pew report in 2008 that found that 1 in 100 Americans are currently incarcerated. The number may have gone down minimally, but we still are approximately the same. Maybe it's 1 in 99 now. But this means that 1 in 30 men between the ages of 20 and 34 years are currently incarcerated. If we look at African-American men, it's 1 in 9 African-American men currently incarcerated between the ages of 20 and 34. African-American women, it's 1 in 100. And if we look at lifetime risk, 1 in 3 African-Americans will have some involvement with a jail or prison setting. 1 in 6 Latinos and 1 in 17 white men. A point I like to make is 60% of women who are incarcerated, 60%, 60, have children under the age of 18, and we have to consider the impact on those children as well. So it's also an issue of equity. The gray bar here is California and the blue is CDCR. So you can see that while Black Californians make up only about 7% of the overall population, they make up almost 30% of the prison population. This is disproportionately high as well for our Hispanic population, as well as disproportionately lower for white Californians. You can see it's about 19% of the prison population, despite being 37% of overall population. So the reasons for this include disparities at every single level. It's from who's pulled over, who's detained, who's offered and able to make bail, who's charged or not charged, and if they are charged, what type or level of crime is chosen. Is it a misdemeanor? Is it a felony? Is it manslaughter? Is it first degree, second degree? There's lots of choices, and many of those choices are made by prosecutors. Sentences in the US are very, very long compared to most other countries, and there's significant sentencing disparity by race. So for a similar offense with a similar criminal background, a Black male will, on average, get a 19% longer sentence than a white male in a similar situation. When we look at life without the possibility of parole for a nonviolent offense, 65% of those sentences go to Black males or Black people, 17% to white, and 15% to Latino. And when we look at youth life sentences, so children getting a life in prison sentence, 80% of those are children of color, and 55% of those are Black youth. So what are some of the reasons for the aging population? We've mentioned long sentences. 1 in 10 people in this country are sentenced to life. There are 3 strikes laws that require a life sentence after 3 strikes, and they don't necessarily have to be violent felonies. They just have to be 3 repeat offenses. There's mandatory minimums. There's enhancements. So for example, if you commit a robbery, but you had a gun in your purse, you can get automatic 10, 15, 20-year enhancement on top of your sentence. And the lack of judicial discretion. So, there are limits on what judges can do with these mandatory sentences. So they might not be able to consider mitigating circumstances such as developmental delay or cognitive impairment or past trauma. In the community, a lack of mental health and substance use and for geriatric patients in the community contributes not only to those entering jail and prisons, but add to recidivism rates when people come out after many years in prison and don't have the supports they need to be successful in the community. And then finally, there's been some recent research that shows that the new conviction rates for older adults is also growing. And there's complicated reasons for this, and I think it needs more research, but it appears to be multifactorial. So nationwide, between 1993 and 2013, we saw a 400% increase in incarcerated adults age 55 and older. In California, we've had a decline in the older overall population, a significant decline from about 150,000 in 2010 to about 100,000 currently. But during that same time period, the number of people 55 and older has increased from 11,000 to 18,000. So even though the population is getting smaller, the challenges with older adults is growing. So can you imagine, struggling with urinary or fecal incontinence while living in an 8x6 cell with another person? Cognitive impairment may put people at risk for rules violations due to misunderstanding. And these rules violations are then reviewed by the parole board and can add additional time to their sentences. People with serious illness and end-of-life care needs to be addressed. We need to think about the profound isolation for older adults in a carceral setting. There's risks of victimization as people become frail or become cognitively impaired and may not be aware of things in the same way they were when they were younger. And then there's, ADA needs, people with declining mobility, risk of fall, visual impairment, hearing impairment. These pictures are common scenes in California prisons. Men and women with ADA needs are provided these vests so that staff and others don't mistakenly think that somebody is violating a rule because they can't see that they're walking into an area that's restricted, or they don't immediately get down on the floor when an alarm goes off as you're expected to because of mobility impairment. So you can see in this picture, there's the gentleman with the cane has a mobility impairment vest, and he's actually guiding a visually impaired man with a white cane down the hallway. In the bottom right is a typical dorm living situation. There's walkers and wheelchairs, there's CPAP machines, oxygen concentrators. So how do you fit all of this medical equipment in a small cell or a dorm space and still have room for, the personal property that's important for you? These pictures really aren't that uncommon. And the pictures that you see from the media are actually the more uncommon pictures for prison. We have an increasing number of vulnerable elders, and this has led to obviously a growing need for long-term care and assisted living. So statewide, our tax dollars are paying for approximately 1,600 medical beds behind bars in California. These medical beds require 24/7 nursing staff who provide support to people who are no longer able to manage their activities of daily living. They're too medically fragile to live in the general population. Among these beds are 63 memory care beds, 30 palliative care beds, and a 17-bed inpatient hospice. Pictured here, it's not a great picture in terms of quality, but I love it because this was one of our hospice patients from quite a while ago. But he, when he was 16, he lied about his age and joined the Army so he could fight in World War II. He ultimately received, bronze battle stars and a Purple Heart and a Philippine Liberation ribbon. And he also received terrible PTSD. And one night when he was in his 60s, he was sleeping in bed with his wife. She had gotten up to go to the bathroom. He woke up in a cold sweat as she was returning, reached under his bed, grabbed his rifle, and shot her because he was back in war. He was, as a result, incarcerated for almost 20 years and then died in our hospice in his 80s. It's a tragic story, and people may think that this is an exceptional case, but over the years, as we've learned more about trauma-informed care, about the impact of adverse childhood experiences, nearly all of our patients have really complex reasons of why they find themselves aging and dying behind bars. Many have caused terrible harm, but they have also been harmed, and many have been rehabilitated for decades. Not surprisingly, our patient population has an extremely high risk of adverse childhood experience when compared to the general population. Over 97% have at least one adverse childhood experience versus 62% in the community. But what I find a really compelling statistic is 78% of incarcerated people have 4 or more adverse childhood experiences versus 16% in the community. So it's really disproportionate, and it obviously has to be considered if we're going to prevent mass incarceration. So these challenges can obviously feel easily overwhelming. And how do we even start to address the problem? What can we do before people commit a crime or are sentenced to long prison terms? One thing we can do is training for police, for lawyers, for judges, parole officers, so that they can recognize issues of aging that may be playing a role in what is being perceived as criminal behavior. One lawyer shared a story of frustration because his client kept stealing the tip jar at the same Starbucks several times a week, despite counsel, despite restraining orders. And looking back, they felt that if they'd better understood dementia and the disinhibition that comes from it, they would have been able to better help their client. Another lawyer at actually a nocturnist event, a storytelling event, told a story about a client who had significant cognitive impairment in a case where he was being tried. He had actually killed a loved one, and he was being tried for this very serious crime, which was a direct result of his dementia. And because she had just gone through a training on dementia, she was able to advocate, and they were able to come up with a solution that had this patient conserved and placed in an assisted living facility instead of a prison. When older adults leave prison or jail without social supports, there's obviously risk of recidivism through parole violation. And there was a study in 2021 that was published in the Journal of the National Academy of Sciences, and it showed that a 30-minute online empathy training for parole officers reduced recidivism rates by 13% and was maintained 10 months after the training. I was involved with Dr. Bree Williams. We were doing a training with her group. I think it's the UCSF Criminal Justice Aging Project. And we were in Hawaii training parole officers. And what we did was we were giving them glasses that had, created the effect of visual impairment. We put bungee cords on their legs to be mobility impairment. They wore gloves to mimic neuropathy. And then they were asked to put beans in a pill container for Monday through Friday so they could manage their medications. And as this officer is trying to do this with her glasses and her gloves, the pills are falling on the floor, she's knocking things over, and she's getting frustrated. And she finally looks up and says, you know, gosh darn it, now I have to be empathic towards my clients. And she meant it as a joke, but she also it helped her understand when that older adult is late for their parole appointment or maybe misses their parole appointment. There's complicated reasons that may happen, and sending them back to jail probably isn't the best solution for anyone. Growing links between police and community services. The same project with Dr. Williams was interviewing San Francisco police. And one officer said, we work 24/7 and our crises don't happen Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. At 2 a.m. on a Sunday morning, we get called about an old person. We can't tell if it's criminal activity or if there's a health problem. The remedies that are available to us in the moment are limited. They can go to the hospital or they can go to jail. So we really need to build up so that police officers have other resources besides jail for older adults. And then this doesn't exist, but it's kind of my dream, is this idea of elder courts, modeled after other specialized courts that have been proven successful for people with mental health issues, substance use disorder. They have special courts for veterans. And in these courts, they bring together appropriate social services to give judges alternatives to prison. One program, a mental health court in Michigan, showed that for every $7 they spent, they saved $7 for every $1 they spent, and were able to reduce recidivism by 300% among that mental health population. I recently had a patient who the family knew she was having declining cognition, and that she was having a disagreement with a neighbor, and they had reached out to police and social services because they were concerned about her safety, but nothing was done. And in her confusion, several weeks later, she believed that her neighbor had harmed her dog. She went to the neighbor's house and she had a broom in her hand. She swung the broom, and her neighbor was also an older woman, and hit her in the neck, collapsed her trachea, and the woman died. This patient was then sentenced to prison, and over the next 8 years, her dementia progressed. She was bedbound, incontinent, unable to meaningfully communicate, and very isolated. Ultimately, on the day before she died, she was released on compassionate release to a hospice program, and her family was able to be with her bedside in the last 24 hours. But, you know, the system failed everyone in that case. They failed the victim, the victim's family, my patient, and her family. How could we have provided, you know, these social support services that would have prevented the crime in the first place? So while we're working towards alternatives to incarceration, we also have real people that we have to support right now who have growing cognitive impairment, serious life-limiting illness, and are ultimately going to die in the prison. What are some things we can do? We're working on increasing trainings in geriatrics and palliative care. And this includes clinical staff, but also custody, so that they can understand that the changes that come along with aging, and then have tools that they need to respond appropriately. A potentially volatile situation can be diverted if an officer has an understanding that someone is cognitively impaired and the behavior that they're seeing is coming from a place of anxiety and not a place of belligerence. The response is very different. We have just opened a memory care unit at our facility, and one of the officers, there's a patient who gets upset, and the officers, we have a binder that says, what are the things that these people connect to? And so everybody knows that if this patient gets upset, he loves this one dog named Angeline, who's part of our Pause for Life companion pet program. And if you just bring her name up, he all of a sudden immediately starts talking about Angeline and a dog from his childhood, and completely changes to a calmer place. So the staff know that that's something we can do for that particular patient. Other things we've done is starting to develop robust peer support models to give that extra layer of companionship. Programs for older adults, so they have recreation, we have karaoke, we have singing programs. We've hired medical social workers to support advanced care planning, being able to identify a surrogate decision maker when the patient's still able to participate in that conversation, rekindling family relationships. So there's potential places for reentry. We've developed, as I said, the memory care unit and then the palliative care and hospice services. So programs like these not only improve care for the patient, but they actually grow staff satisfaction. When people have the tools to do the right thing, it prevents them from emotionally shutting down and not treating people with humanity, or, suffering their own moral injury. So now I'm going to share with you our 17-bed hospice program that is behind prison walls as an example of maybe a best practice. So the California Medical Facility was started in response to the HIV/AIDS epidemic in the early 90s. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who's considered the godmother of the hospice movement in the United States by many, heard about all of these men dying at the California Medical Facility in the late 80s of HIV and AIDS, completely alone in their cells. There was actually a unit that said, "Beware, do not enter danger, infectious disease." And so these men, their peers were afraid of them, custody staff was afraid of them, and medical workers at that time were still afraid of people with HIV. So they were very isolated. So Elizabeth and her team came in and started doing support groups through community advocates like ACT UP, incarcerated men advocating, prison workers who saw the need for this. It ended up developing into a 17-bed inpatient hospice. And in the first year, we had 56 people die of HIV in the hospice. But when I started in 2006, we had 0 people. So since I've been there, we've had 1 person die of HIV, and he, for personal reasons, didn't want to take the medications. But the vast majority of our patients are now older adults with cancer, degenerative neurologic conditions, end-stage organ disease. And this space really allows for dignity at the end of life for the patients, the family, and for staff. The hospice entrance criteria are very similar to those in the community. You have to have a terminal illness, but it's your choice. If you want to keep doing the chemotherapy, even though I might think that that's not in your best interest, you have every right to make that decision if you have decision-making capacity. So, people come to hospice based on their own desires. I am not bound by Medi-Cal or Medicare criteria, so we're a little bit looser. We want people to get the service if they have a prognosis of less than 6 to 12 months. They generally forgo curative treatments, and we focus on palliative care. We have a multidisciplinary team with a chaplain. We have physicians. We have well-trained nursing staff, dietitians, medical social workers. This incredible peer worker program that I'll share a little bit more about. And then we do include the officer, particularly the counselor, who does a lot of work on supporting the compassionate release process. So with this multidisciplinary team, we're really able to provide full spectrum of palliative care. And we even work to provide some bereavement support to families. So it looks like a typical nursing home, nothing really special if it was a nursing home, but in a prison setting, it really feels normal. There's no locks, there's no bars. The patients can come up to the nursing station, they can interact with the doctors, with their peers, with each other freely, instead of using bars and handcuffs to maintain security in this space. And these are the same people who were in a locked facility just the day before they came to hospice. We use a concept called dynamic security. So through mutual respect, through really getting to know our patients, we understand their anxieties and their challenges, and we can address problems before they lead to security risk. It's very, very few behavioral or security problems in this setting. And this is an example. We have some fish tanks. We have art. This is an example of one of the rooms. It's small, it seems small, but the blinds on the window, there are bars, but the blinds make it feel more homey. Instead of the standard metal toilet and metal sink in a prison cell, there's a porcelain toilet and sink. We really encourage the patients to have personal belongings. Families can send pictures from their childhood, of their family members, and the social workers will get them approved by custody and then print them out for the patients. We'll print out things that have meaning. One patient really loved airplanes recently. He had worked in with military airplanes before coming to prison, and the social worker printed out a whole bunch of different types of airplanes, and it's just a great conversation starter for whoever, whatever volunteer or whoever comes into the space. We have a beautiful garden that was supported by the California Healthcare Foundation, and CDCR provided labor and the materials. We've had weddings here, baptisms, we do memorial services. It's open for staff, patients, and patients' families when they visit. Another picture. It was really designed. We had people from design program at UC Davis create an environment that's really restorative. It was designed to attract butterflies. It includes textures and smells. We talked to incarcerated people about what they'd want. And you can see a little glimpse of grass over in the corner. Men wanted to be able to walk in the grass before they died. That was something that was important to people. So we recently transferred in a patient with dementia who was housed alone on a medical unit at another facility for years inside this room. And bringing him into the hospice garden for the first time to see trees and flowers, hummingbirds, butterflies, to touch and smell mint and rosemary. These simple things that we take for granted were really mind-blowing for this man who'd been in prison for nearly 40 years. He had a huge smile on his face. He kept thanking us and saying, "This is delightful." And since that day, our team has managed to reconnect him with his family. He had 3 daughters that he hadn't spoken to in 25 years. His daughters are grateful for this opportunity. It's changed the course of their life to be able to connect with him. They do video visits at least weekly, and he's taken up singing. So even though he has virtually no short-term memory, we found basically that he knows every word to every song from the 1950s, and he loves a good sing-along with our social worker. A big part of our program is to support people who support people spiritually, no matter how that might manifest for them. And this is a patient who had a strong Eastern religious philosophy. Our chaplain has community volunteers from various faiths and communities. He's had pagan practitioners, Wiccans, Sufis, all sorts of different people come into the hospice to support different patients. There's a story that always moved me about, we had a very young Vietnamese man who was dying of cancer, and his mother had been visiting him regularly in hospice. And when he died, the chaplain was offering her bereavement support, and it came out that not only was she sad that her son had died, but her belief system was that his soul would be eternally kept in the place where he died unless a particular ceremony was conducted. So the chaplain was able to get a Thai Buddhist monk from Berkeley to come in. We got the warden to approve the mother returning, even though her son was no longer there. And they were able to conduct a ceremony with a flower and a cookie and a candle in the room where he had died and release his spirit from the prison. And so that mother didn't have to live with the idea that her son was eternally incarcerated. We have in Native American patients, there is a Native American sweat lodge. Most of our patients are too sick to participate in that, but they can do a smudge ceremony. This patient was working in the garden before we had our beautiful garden, and so the chaplain had pulled together some pots so that he could put his hands in the earth, which was important for him. There's recreational therapy. We have puzzles and card tournaments and bingo. We have community volunteers who come in each month and bring birthday cakes to celebrate the birthday. We just got an upgraded video game system because many of our patients really use the video games as a meditation. It allows them to take their head really outside of thinking about their problems and get their heads cleared. We do legacy building where the social workers and art teachers help them create a project that emphasizes the positive things in their lives and not just that there's somebody dying in prison, and we're able to provide those projects to their family if they want. So one of the most amazing parts of our program, from my perspective, is the peer support workers. So in May of 2018, Suleika Jawad, a writer, published an article in the New York Times Magazine after spending about 2 weeks observing, every day observing our program. And what she ended up finding most compelling after those 2 weeks was three young men who work in our hospice, and they spend their days elbow to elbow with medical staff as colleagues, caring for sick and dying, but they're peers. They're also incarcerated men. And all three of them had committed, violent gang-related crimes when they were 17, 18, 19. And now in their 30s and 40s, they really want to give back. And this program, benefits the patients, the peer workers, and the staff. The peers are able to connect with the patient and support them on a really deep level, due to their shared experience of being incarcerated, of being separated from their families, and the near universal fear of dying in prison. And most of these men who are working, I think 65% are lifers themselves. So there's a real possibility that they too someday will be dying in a prison hospice. It's a powerful experience for the workers themselves. It gives meaning to their lives. It teaches empathy skills, gives them self-worth. The gentleman pictured here, Kevon Lyman, spoke of the person he was when he committed his crime. He said, "Before I was numb, death didn't hold the weight that it should have." And his work in hospice has really been transformational. Since this article was written, he's actually been released, and he works in social services in the community and continues to give back. These are truly success stories. And third, this program provides a great support to staff, and contributes to the really high quality care that we're able to provide. The staff really love working with these men. I don't know if you're all familiar with GeriPal. It's a UCSF Department of Geriatrics with Dr. Alex Smith and Eric Guadera, and they do a podcast called GeriPal, Geriatrics and Palliative Care. And they actually had an opportunity to come and work with us in the hospice, and they interviewed myself, which you don't need to listen to because you're hearing it now, but they also interviewed 3 of our peer workers in their part 2 episode. So I encourage you to listen to it. It's really compelling work that they're doing. So the program is run by our chaplain. We're working to formalize the training that he does so that we can expand this program statewide. So anywhere there's people with serious illness, anywhere there's somebody in a medical bed, they're going to get this companionship and support, in my dream world. The applications for workers are, they have to meet certain criteria. We purposely try to identify diverse groups in terms of age, ethnicity, faith, so that we can best serve the population that we're caring for. And they do get extensive training, not only in end-of-life care for others, but self-care, because this is hard work, and they're doing it. They're sitting with 60 to 70 people die each year in our hospice, and they're sitting with every single one of them so that no one dies alone. One peer volunteer said, "When I first joined the hospice program, I didn't fully understand who we were going to help. I didn't realize how many people were here in the prison were dying. I originally joined the program because I saw it as a way to atone for things I've done, but I've learned more about myself in the past year. I've found abilities and strengths I didn't know I had." So one of my favorite aspects of this program is the positive culture that we have there spreads out into other areas of the facility. We had a patient, and other places, we had a patient that, he was in the last 2 weeks of his life, probably. He had a daughter who was incarcerated at a women's facility in Southern California, who was in an administrative segregation unit, so an isolation unit, and she struggled with mental illness. And he wanted to say goodbye to her before he died. And we don't usually, incarcerated people can't really call other incarcerated people, but our warden gave permission and said he'd ask the warden at the other facility if this was possible. That warden agreed and assigned a captain to arrange the phone call. And they ended up having about a 15-minute phone call where they were able to say goodbye. The other institution organized mental health support to help the daughter with her grief. And our patient was, so grateful he got to say goodbye. But to me, the best part of that was a couple days later, the captain at that other facility who'd arranged that wrote our chaplain and said, in 25 years of service, this was the most rewarding thing that he had done. So this captain, who may go on to be an associate warden or a warden, he understands on a really personal level that you can have safety and security and allow people their humanity. And then finally, one of the most important jobs of any hospice is to support family, and we do our best to do this. This wreath was a gift from a family to the hospice staff in appreciation for the opportunity that they had to spend with their loved one at the end of his life. Our chaplain does an incredible job of uniting families so that they have an opportunity to have closure or, reconciliation when it's needed. He has a story where he used Google Maps. So we had already tried to contact the family at this gentleman's family home. It appeared they had moved. So the chaplain used Google Street View. He found the house. He spun the camera around and there was a church across the street. So he zoomed in on the sign. And then he called the people at the church and they're like, oh, we know that family. They lived there for decades and they moved 4 blocks over or something. So someone went out from the church and notified the family to call the chaplain. And they were so happy. They thought that their son had been involved with, he'd been living on the streets. He'd been struggling with substance use disorder and they had lost contact years ago. And so they were able to come into hospice and be with him before he died. Another story where we had a patient who, he weighed about 85 pounds. He was in his 80s. He was dying of lung cancer and he really wanted to apologize because in his younger days, he had been a raging alcoholic and he had actually was in prison because he had killed his wife in an act of domestic violence in front of his children. And so his young daughters were taken away and grew up with other family members and have always thought of him as a monster and had never seen him again. And now he's dying and he wants to say he's sorry. So our chaplain reached out to the family carefully because he didn't want to re-traumatize them, just to let them know that he was in fact in hospice and dying. And at first they said they want nothing to do with him. And the next day the daughter called back and said she had talked to her sisters and they think they need to come and see him. So we arranged and they were able to come into the hospice and the chaplain and we had a psychologist supported them and they ended up talking for several hours. And in the end, they were able to give him the forgiveness that he needed. But to me, what was even more important, these women were in their 30s and 40s, and now they can live the rest of their lives without this monster sitting on their shoulders. So, it's a powerful place to work. And although we have managed to create an environment where patients are truly getting high quality end of life care in this hospice, the reality is no matter how good the care may be, our patients' near universal end of life goal is to not die in prison. So a significant aspect of my work or anyone's work as a palliative care doctor in this setting has to be to support patients in achieving their freedom. So not only are there ethical reasons for supporting this perspective, but there's public safety and fiscal arguments for reducing the number of older adults in prison. The Osborne Association put out a white paper in May of 2018 called The High Costs of Low Risk. So these patients cost an extraordinary amount of money. They're 3 to 5 times as expensive as their younger counterparts. They incur the vast majority of off-site hospitalization costs for the state, sometimes edging up towards the millions of dollars per patient, requiring infrastructure upgrades, elevators, level terrain, adaptive supports. And this growing burden is on systems nationwide. It's already becoming fiscally untenable. And then when we look at the risk to society, recidivism rates in general are 45 to 65% for people going in and out of prison with our current practices. But when we look at older adults and people who had life sentences in California, when they are granted parole by the parole board, they have a less than 4% recidivism rate, including felonies and misdemeanors. And if you look at people who do harm against another, it's less than 0.4%. And when you look at people who are truly in the end stages of life and have serious illness. In my 15 plus years of working with compassionate release, I know of 0 cases of recidivism when in that situation. This population has been behind bars. They've been punished for decades. Many have been successfully rehabilitated. And many have been eligible for parole consideration for decades. We have people who've been to the parole board 15, 16 times, but just are not able to convey enough to reassure that they are no longer a risk to public safety. So what are the barriers to release? Part of this is a lack of pathways for communication between medical providers and the decision makers regarding parole. I've had patients go before the parole board who had significant dementia, but somehow this information wasn't adequately conveyed to the decision makers. We have people who have, terminal diagnoses and prognoses of very short term, and they go before courts, and that's not part of the consideration. So we need to improve that. We need to be able to allow parole boards and courts to make decisions with the full picture of our patients. Without, limited housing options is another big problem. It's hard for people to find housing and re-enter. There's societal changes facing all older adults. There's a lack of affordable housing and growing homelessness among elders in the community, not to mention the added challenges of our population who have lost community connections over decades of incarceration, and also the stigma of incarceration. So, I guess as a society, we don't say that we're keeping older adults in prison because they don't have housing options. But practically, this is what's happening. Without a safe post-release plan, parole boards, courts, they're loath to release someone that they fear without a supportive environment may still pose a risk to public safety. So what is healthcare's role? There's a group in Washington, D.C. where community providers actually provide summaries. They're contracted to provide summaries of patients with complex medical needs to the federal prison system, so that this information can be used to create a more complete picture for decision makers. And we've been working on that in California as well. They need to know if people have cognitive impairment, poor prognoses, et cetera. We need to develop reentry programs in the community that focus on the needs of the elderly and infirm. These programs exist for people with substance use disorder, with HIV, with mental health challenges, and we need to grow the programs that support older adults coming out of prison. We need to build relationships and overcome stigmas with skilled nursing facilities and assisted living. This patient here, he allows me to share his story because he wants to grow the compassionate release process so other people can benefit like he did. But he did get compassionate release. We worked long and hard to find a nursing home that would take him. We finally found that one was willing to accept him. And it was in part because the medical director had a personal connection to someone who was incarcerated. And they agreed to take him and said they wouldn't take another patient for 6 to 12 months though. So we got him, he got granted by the courts because he had a place to go. He went there, he had end-stage lung disease. He had family in the area, but they all had jobs and children and lives. They couldn't stay home and care for him 24/7. So they were elated to be able to visit him in this nursing home setting. They brought him all his favorite meals. They were so grateful to the nursing home staff. It was an incredible experience for the nursing home. He died 7 days later. And when he died, the nursing home called me and said, okay, we have a bed, we'll take another patient. So it went from we're not taking someone else for a year to we'll take somebody else now. So by breaking down the stigma and barriers, I think there's real opportunity to give our patients more opportunities to return. We need to add medical social workers to prisons and jails to support older adults. We need to include input from medical when they're designing policy and legislative changes that make decisions about this population. So I do want to mention compassionate release because it's a great example of how using geriatric and other medical experts in working with legislators and advocacy groups can streamline a process and expand the criteria. So previously the process was so slow and involved so many hoops that it almost never happened, and most people died before making it through. Now, instead of a 6-month or 12-month prognosis, that can be challenging for a doctor, and we tend to be overly optimistic when we make these decisions. It's now an end-of-life trajectory, which opens it up and allows us to refer more people in a more timely manner so that they don't die during the process. Historically, the process took so long that most people died before they could make it through. Also included now is permanent medically incapacitated. So somebody has a stroke and now they're require support with their activities of daily living. They can be considered. The prior legislation that didn't include medical people, the criteria was brain death. So obviously that's not very useful, and you can see the benefit of including medical expertise. So in the last 2 years, we've actually increased our compassionate releases by over 200%. We've developed a tracking tool to make sure things don't fall off. We've trained providers in prognostication to get them to refer people earlier. And now the real barrier is post-release planning. That's our hardest thing, is finding a plan, because the courts won't consider the application until there's a clear plan. The benefits to the patient are obvious. The gentleman pictured here, he was almost 90. He'd spent decades in prison and had end-stage lung disease. He previously might not have qualified because it's hard to prognosticate end-stage lung disease. But I think we could say with certainty that a 90-year-old man who was oxygen dependent from his degree of lung disease was at an end-of-life trajectory. So he was able to get submitted. His nephew flew out to California, picked him up, brought him home to Maryland, where he's lived his last few months being honored as the veteran that he was. The benefits to the family. A few years ago, we had a patient who was actively dying, but he was holding on to get through the process because he really wanted to be able to die at home with his 13-year-old daughter. And in the end, he got out. He spent his last 2 weeks with his daughter. They watched their favorite movies together. They were able to talk and reconnect. And, you know, when he died, it's so compelling to me that this 13-year-old daughter, you know, she has a story now that I was able to support my father at the end of his life, and not a narrative that I am somebody whose dad died in prison. And, you know, that digs deeper into the larger community. To staff, just this week, we had a hospice patient with developmental delay who'd been incarcerated for 27 years, and he was able to return home to his sisters. And both he and his brother had been incarcerated since their 20s for involvement in the same crime. And his brother had died of COVID last year when COVID swept through the prison system. And so the joy and gratitude from this patient and his sisters to be able to have him with them before he died was an incredible boost to our entire team. And with safe housing plans, we could likely increase those who benefit from this program by up to 50%. So I see time is running short, and I did want to leave time for a few questions. So I hope this talk has grown your understanding of this vulnerable group. A few tips: if you're working in a clinic and your patients are returning from incarceration, remember there's some amazing programs out there. Family Community Medicine's own Dr. Shira Shavit is Executive Director of the Transitions Clinic Network. It's a reentry program that links people throughout the state to services. They have case managers with lived experience who can help people navigate the reentry process. If you're working in a specialty clinic and have forensic patients in oncology or rheumatology, you know, right, this person has an end-of-life trajectory. They have a terminal illness, and you should consider them for compassionate release to maybe trigger a doctor who wasn't already thinking that inside the system. If you're working in the ER, remember that our patients have lost their physical liberty, but they retain their autonomy with respect to medical decisions, and they have a right to communicate with their family when they're making difficult end-of-life decisions. There is a policy and procedure within the Department of Corrections to allow family to go to the bedside, even in an outside hospital. So if you're not able to navigate that with the officers at the bedside, ask them for the number of the chief medical officer, for the warden, for the doctor on call. And you should be able to help speak to the patient's family and include them in any sort of critical medical decisions. And then finally, ethical considerations for our patients are the same as for any other patient. So don't assume that they lack rights in making these decisions. Finally, this work is incredibly challenging and incredibly rewarding. And I have to make a plug because we currently have a newly created position for a physician in our palliative care team. We're also hiring doctors at the California Medical Facility where the hospice is located in Vacaville, between Sacramento and San Francisco. And we always need compassionate nurses. I'm working to expand the role of medical social workers to do palliative care work statewide. So if anyone has an interest, these are my numbers. Please feel free to reach out. Okay, and any questions? And I'm sorry, I did go over my time, I think.
No worries. Michelle, I want to thank you for an incredibly impactful, moving presentation. I definitely had some tears as you were speaking, and I suspect I'm not alone. I think this talk will be with many of us for a long time. For me, I think what it really made me think about is the role of each of us, not just in taking care of a single patient, but the family and the community and the connections to the system. And I just think you brought that together so beautifully with all of the pieces of advocacy and hope, and bringing hope into an otherwise really difficult situation. I feel like this is exactly the kind of work that we are ready to do in family medicine. And I would encourage anybody who has interest or questions to reach out directly to Michelle. Given time and needing to get people to clinic, I'm just going to read the two comments that two of the comments that came in, and then Michelle, I'll give you a minute for the last word. Esther Melton asked about compensation for incarcerated hospice worker, and Cameron Rumbach said, I don't have a question, but just wanted to say how powerful and moving Michelle's presentation was, which I second. So Michelle, I'm going to give you the final word here, and just say thank you to everybody for joining us, and thank you, Michelle, especially for such an impactful and beautiful presentation.
Thank you. I just thank you all for listening. And honestly, if anybody has an interest in pursuing this, advocating, if you have a skilled nursing facility who wants to accept our patients, please reach out. I talk about this stuff all the time, and I'm always happy to make connections with the community. So please reach out. Oh, and sorry for the question about corporate compensation for hospice workers. It's not good. I mean, we don't pay people well in prison, but it is meaningful work, and they get a lot out of it. And we are working to, through CalAIM, to create a certification program so that they can achieve these 17 core competencies and actually get a certification that they can show the parole board as something that's a plus for them. And then if they do get released, they have the opportunity for significant well-paying jobs under CalAIM for paraprofessionals as peer support specialists and community health workers.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and thanks to everyone for joining us. Thanks. Bye-bye.